Released in Japan and North America in 1989, Nintendo's Game Boy quickly became the fastest growing tech to have. Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring a portion of this video. The Famicom and NES had already solidified themselves as the console of choice in these areas, so having that Nintendo magic in your pocket was a no-brainer.
Brian, people ask, how do you cope with being a disembodied brain? Just floating in a jar with no girls, no music, no car, no parties. It's not so bad, I say. I just play with my Game Boy.
Arriving in Europe a year later, it sold even quicker, which was surprising given Europe's preference for the Master System over Nintendo's console. But the Game Boy did a lot right, which arguably better machines like the Game Gear and Atari Lynx just couldn't compete with.
But wait! Super Mario is back!
Battery life, some killer titles, and a superb marketing campaign really worked in the Game Boy's favour. And although these points evaded Sega and Atari, there were some other, lesser-known manufacturers who felt they could sneak in and capitalise as well.
And just one of the great games out now on Game Boy!
But they were wrong. So very wrong. The first to make it to Europe was the GameMaster, released in France and Germany sometime in 1990. Originally an Asian system that seems to have been distributed by Watara, it was picked up by a German toy manufacturer, Hartung. Hartung on that thing! Although in Germany they'd more say Hartung. And then distributed in other European countries by other companies. Hartung's idea here was simple: capitalise on a market where the Game Boy hadn't yet become dominant by selling a similar console at a cheaper price. And it could have worked, if not for this. Christ, the games here are absolutely pitiful. At least 19 titles were released for the GameMaster, and at least 19 of them were utter tripe. Bundled, we get the incredibly named Falling Block. Of course we do, it's a Tetris ripoff, and it's utter dogshit. Tetris is a great game. It has great music, it has a nice difficulty curve, it's addictive. This is like someone has poured Tetris out into a bucket and all the good elements have dripped onto the floor. It is essentially Tetris, but it lacks the charm, the fun, and on top of it all, we've got this weird slanted directional pad. Why is it even like that? It's a nuisance. If you can get past some of the artwork on the packaging, we can attempt to play some games. Here's Space Castle. It's a shmup, but really highlights how limited the screen is. It's not terrible, there are far worse, but we have to turn the contrast up quite high to see what's going on, and that produces this upsetting ghosting effect. But the real limitation is the 64x64 monochrome LCD grid. The Game Boy has a resolution of 160x144, allowing things to be defined with a good amount of detail. With the GameMaster, things have to be drawn as blocks or sticks, and that's quite a fundamental limitation. Here's Kung Fu, which is just about playable, but it's literally stick figures. Don't get me wrong, this was the 90s, and for any child that is used to Tiger handheld games, this would have been a revelation, but it wasn't going to stand up to the experience offered by the Game Boy, and being 2/3 of the price wasn't going to make up for that. I mean, can you imagine being a kid and opening this up on Christmas morning? Your parents would think they'd outsmarted the system by getting a game system for half the price, but you would be like a crushed relic in a vacuum tube, a broken spoon, absolutely dismayed inside, whilst putting on a front of utter glee and excitement. These are the kids who went on to be door-to-door salesmen. They got the skills to act excited over something that was utter crap. For those who did keep playing the console, the 4 AA batteries would give you quite a few hours of gameplay. Not as many as the Game Boy, which is often touted today as having 25 hours worth of gameplay. But that's with modern batteries, folks. Batteries in the 90s weren't that good. Headphones would provide bleeps directly into your ears, and the 2 kilobytes of RAM combined with an 8-bit NEC MPD78C11A processor meant you really had nothing else to live for. By 91, Hartung had pushed the system out in Spain, Italy and Portugal, but the rights were non-exclusive in France, with companies like Videojet and Delplay also releasing their own variations. Delplay would actually reconfigure the console entirely to make it more like a Game Boy, sorting that weird directional pad and adding protection so that only their cartridges could be played in the device, but not the other way round. However, the main problem was the core hardware and the lack of games available, which didn't go away by improving the outer case. By late '91, Sistema decided it would launch in the UK as the Sistema 2000, priced at $49.99 and undercutting the Game Boy by about 30 quid, but it was just too late. Gaming magazine The One wrote, "Is it time to throw away your Game Boy? We think not." Even with the promise of the free-of-charge Sistema 2000 Club and an additional 20 games promised before the end of the year, it was still no bueno. But that didn't stop other manufacturers and distributors from trying their luck. And you know, their luck might have been better if they'd used sponsor SqSpace to market their product and build a decent website. You can pick from so many styles and use Blueprint AI to get the best layout and style options, along with optimized SEO tools so that you can show up in Google for the keywords that matter. It's just easy to snap features in and out, but one of my favourite abilities is to swap between mobile and desktop views so that you can optimize your content for every device and make sure it looks great. Just head to Squarespace for a free trial, and when you're ready, go to squarespace.com/nostalgianerd to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Generally seen as a much more competent handheld, the GameMate, or GameMate, or GameMate, was developed by Bit Corporation operating out of Taipei, Taiwan in 1990. Bit Corporation had made a number of clone consoles in the past, so had a good chunk of knowledge of the gaming industry and had the same idea of capitalizing on the launch of the Game Boy. Originally launching in China and Taiwan, Bit Corporation had enough contacts to also push the console out in other markets. Interestingly, this isn't the first machine to carry the name. VTech released the GameMate 3D back in 1983, a kind of cartridge version of the Tomitronic series and the first 3D handheld game system. It did not sell well. By early '91, the GameMate was not only released in Australia and Argentina, but also most of Europe and the United States, although the latter only by mail order. In the UK, distribution was handled by the well-known peripherals and joystick manufacturer Cheetah, pricing the console at £59.99, about £20 less than the Game Boy. Compared to the GameMaster, the GameMate is much closer to the Game Boy in terms of spec and operation. Again, it consumes 4 AA batteries, but has a 4-shade 160 by 152 pixel screen. It packs 16 kilobytes of RAM, an AY sound chip, and a 6502 based CPU. Although it looks similar to the GameMaster, we've got a much more friendly layout here. Plus, like the Game Boy, we can connect 2 consoles together with a link cable, if you can find anyone else who has a console. Interestingly, carts are not carts, they are cards, much like the PC Engine or early Master System games, which does limit scope for features like battery backup save states. But I think Bit Corporation were being honest with themselves and knew they wouldn't need that feature. Out of the box, we get a little game called Cube Up. Of course we do. And guess what? It's a Tetris clone, with the important words, "Don't touch Golden Finger by hands," on the rear. I mean, the audacity to even think I would try. Stop it! Listen to that music. Definite ZX Spectrum vibes. Cube Up is actually a decent clone, to be fair. The music is a little intense. It's definitely no Korabinaki, but overall it's a good attempt. And if you wanted more games, you wouldn't be short on titles for this one either. There are reportedly 71 games for this little console, although with most of them churned out by Bitcorp, you might imagine that the quality starts to slip a bit, if it hadn't already. Just like the GameMaster, that slippage starts with the box art. Game Boy box art is generally fantastic. It gets the neurons firing, it makes you want to play. This stuff is absolute nightmare material. Look at this guy. He looks like he's just had something unexpected shoved right up his arse. He's not even sure what it is. Ah yes, Kill Shot. What an incredible shoot 'em up. So graceful I couldn't put it down. Myth of Vasamia is a platformer. Box Forum is a game. Monster Pitfall is also a game. Yes, it's like Pitfall. And, you know, this really is the issue with all these consoles. The Game Boy had massive publishers and developers releasing titles, but the GameMate had themselves furiously trying to produce games as quick as possible. Bold aspirations, but it was always going to be a game of catch-up. Plus, the GameMate suffers from extreme motion blur, worse than the Game Boy, to the point where you just often can't see what's going on at all. But it seems Big Corp were using two suppliers for screens, and one of them is better than the other. So if you were one of the quote lucky ones, unquote, you'd only get terrible motion blur as opposed to absolutely atrocious. In either case, the GameMate would still lead to the untimely demise of Big Corporation by the end of 1992. Taiwanese chip manufacturer UMC would take over manufacture and actually extracted a couple more years' life out of the little console, releasing several titles themselves and gaining a little resurgence in Italy and even the UK, where it was relaunched by Maplin. But it was never going to cut it, pretty much dying out by 93, although UMC released The Golden Pyramid and Insect War in 95 as a last salute to its fans. You lucky devils. A console that fared slightly better than both of these, and that was pushed on the UK TV show Bad Influence, was of course the Watara SuperVision, distributed in the US by Gold Nation and in the UK by Quickshot, another joystick manufacturer. It seems Watara were having another go, and this one making it a bit more competent.
Of course, you might want a handheld. There are 4 main ones and they all come with a game. The cheapest is the SuperVision, which has a monochrome screen and costs around $39.95. It also has the cheapest games at around £15 each.
I've actually spoken to Violet several times about why they kept talking about the SuperVision on the show, and it seems like it might have been a bit of a sponsored arrangement. See, Quickshot knew they needed to get this thing noticed, and so they pushed the console on, one of the only TV gaming shows of the time in the UK in the hope it would catch on. And to some extent, it kind of worked. I know that I wanted one. Although late to the party, the SuperVision was the first handheld that seemed like a viable competitor. I mean, leaving the Game Gears, Lynxes, PC Engines and Wonder Swans aside, of course. It not only undercut the Game Boy in price, retailing at a similar price to the previous clones, but it actually had the edge in some specifications. The CPU was a familiar 6502 compatible affair, but the 61mm 160 by 160 pixel screen with 4 shades of grey was significantly larger than Nintendo's offering. The model received in the UK and America also had this tilt mechanism, allowing you to reduce glare that made these screens so problematic. Although it's more of a novelty than anything else. Come on, you know this. Original Taiwan versions actually looked like this, much more like a Game Boy, but it was felt the snazzy hinged version would set it apart from Nintendo-dominated markets. Also marketed as the Travel Mate, just look at that Watara seal of quality. An accessory that connected it directly to the TV, allowing 4 colour mode like the Super Game Boy, was also promised but never released, at least not in Western territories. Hype and momentum was the order of the day here. Another selling point, like the other consoles, was for cheaper games. £15 for a title was certainly more appealing for parents than a £40 game. But not for the gamers themselves, with titles like the bundled Crystball, a Breakout clone, failing to appeal, especially when you can't see what's going on due to motion blur. And I mean, the music doesn't help. What is that, a 1 second loop? Electronic Games magazine put it best when they wrote, "It's still possible to be disappointed in a game that costs less than $15. The SuperVision was previewed at the 1992 CES with 18 launch titles and promises of over 50 by the end of the year, with licensed titles including Rambo and Terminator to follow in '93, even Mortal Kombat if we were lucky. But this is a tune we'd heard before. The importers and distributors had to make these big promises. They had to hype these products up, otherwise they stood no chance. Turns out they stood no chance anyway.
Passa SuperVision, ti conviene! C'è già il fantastico Crisp Ball incluso! E poi c'è Alien! Pilota la tua astronave!
In fact, the best performing markets were the ones where the original model was imported, even leading to a third enhanced model known as the Magnum. But no matter how far you stretch for tracks, ultimately the metal was always going to fail. But this was a train that was already rolling, for anyone who decided they did have a chance. So why the hell not chuck a duck into the equation? A mega fricking duck. Yeah. It's a play on Wonder Swan. Come on, this is what they do. Hong Kong-based Wellback Holdings weren't going to let Taiwan do all the lifting. Launching in the Netherlands, France and Germany in early '93, the Megaduck is probably the closest machine to the Game Boy that we have. And I mean that in terms of build quality, technical specifications and general playability. It's actually pretty nice all round. The Sharp CPU is almost identical to a Z80, and the 160x144 4 grayscale screen is almost identical to the Game Boy. So much so that some Megaduck games were actually ported to the Game Boy as unofficial releases. So if you can forget the fact that the snake in Snake Roy, yes, Snake Roy, looks like an ever-extending penis, then you might get onto titles like Armor Force, Magic Tower, Street Rider. Ah yes, Martonra, my favourite brand. And Magic Maze, which is actually quite a fun little puzzler. But you'll probably never get over it. I certainly couldn't myself. And so those games will be useless to you, along with the 37 titles in its arsenal. But remember, all these handhelds suffer from the same problem that the Game Boy has anyway. The Duck may not have made it to the UK, but it was launched in South America as the Cougar Boy, mainly because it apparently sounded more manly and assertive. I don't think that's the case, folks. Might want to check the meaning of things beforehand. Ultimately, none of these consoles were successful because of the Game Boy. They tried, by God they tried, but it's a fool's game and they were never going to compete. Not even the Game Child could compete, I mean, come on! Or the Game Wizard, which I've spared you in this video because I already made a video about it 4 years ago. Relegating these machines to history, because the Game Boy was such a force that even toy manufacturers made wind-up clones like these god-awful Tomy Pocket Perils that had about as much replay value as a cactus, even for a toddler. So surely, as the Game Boy got older and more popular, other manufacturers weren't going to make the same mistake, were they? Ah yes, thegame.com. Well, that's a story for another day. With that said, even though these consoles were failures, they did in fact still bring joy to the hearts of some in the 90s. Sure, it wasn't one of the mainstream brands, but if you had fun with your SuperVision over Christmas '92, then you had fun with it, and that's all that really matters. And it's those people who are still releasing games and hardware today. Yep, you can buy a multi-cart for your SuperVision, for your Megaduck, even for the GameMaster. You can buy carry cases, you can even buy carts like Journey to the West, an RPG which only worked on the SuperVision Magnum but has now been adapted to work across all versions. Despite the crapness, there is still love for this hardware, and you know what? Good. I'm glad there is. Mainstream sucks anyway. Until next time, I've been Nostalgia Nerd. Toodaloo.